Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you, CSRBOX team, for having me moderate this panel. And I'm joined by an amazing group of panelists over here who are representing the CSR community, the impact investors, as well as the advisors to the family offices. I'm sure that it is going to be an exciting discussion. Before we start the discussion, I want to get a sense of the audience as well, right? So please just raise your hands. How many of you are from non-profits organizations representing non-profits? Okay. What about for-profit organizations which are working in the social impact field? Okay. How many of you are funders or anyone on the donor side or the commercial provider side? Okay. There is one only. Okay. So how many of you are well versed with blended finance? Okay, at least know about blended finance in general. Okay. Last question. So how many of you have been a participant in the blended finance structures? Maybe an recipient of those funds or, okay, there is one. Okay, I think so. Today's discussion is going to give a lot of insights, and I hope that many of you will be either on the demand or the supply side of blended finance transactions. So before we start our discussion, I would like to give some insights about blended finance market in general, as I have had the first-hand experience of working in the blended finance facility before I moved to LGT Venture Philanthropy. So a little bit of background about LGT. LGT Venture Philanthropy, it's a princely family of Liechtenstein's philanthropy, and we provide core grant support to the organizations working in the area of education, healthcare, and environment. While blended finance is not one of the focus areas, but we do support our portfolio organizations in trying out these innovative structures. For example, we are supporting one organization to create these green market instruments, which can bring in industry to pay for the for the payment of ecosystem services. So in general, let me talk about a blended finance market in general. So as per the recent report, which has been initiated by Asha Impact and Impact Investors Council, the India blended finance market currently stands at around USD $1.3 billion and is expected to double the size within the next 4 to 5 years. I think that 4 to 5 years is still a long period, but if done right, we may see that happening within the next couple of years. However, what we have seen in last 5 to 10 years is that there is a lot of social capital coming in this particular development sector. The public expenditure is increasing, the private philanthropies or international foundations are also coming in. But what we have seen is the large amount of CSR capital, which is also entering in this area. And what's surprising is that largely we have seen DFIs, multilaterals, or international foundations participating in the blended finance structures. But lately, we are seeing CSR capital also trying to come in some of these structures, which are CSR regulatory compliant. We have seen participants like 361 Foundation. Saumya is representing that foundation here. And the others like IndusInd and JSW, who have been the early entrants in this particular area. So what is exciting is that we are sitting on a massive opportunity when it comes to say CSR. There is 25,000 crore plus CSR spend every year. And imagine if 5 to 10% of that capital comes in. And historically, we have seen the leverage of at least 5x on this catalytic capital. So imagine the kind of opportunity we can see when it comes to say achieving the sustainable development goals or helping the country in climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. So it's clear that while blended finance may not be a silver bullet, but actually it's one of the way to bring in more capital and reduce the funding gap in India. So without further delay, let me start the discussion today. So I'll start with one common question for each one of you. So could you please briefly highlight your background, what prompted your organization to adopt a blended finance approach? What was the motivation? So what we'll do, we'll start with you, Saumya, and then Prabhir, and then Alifya.
Good morning, everyone. Saumya Lashkari. For those of you who are not familiar with 361, it was formerly IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, one of India's largest and leading wealth advisors, and also alternates focused asset manager with over $40 billion, I believe, aggregate assets under management. 361 Foundation has reimagined traditional grant giving. So we have prioritized CSR compliant approaches using blended finance and outcome based funding. So essentially, we're trying to unlock more capital, recycle capital, and have a disproportionate focus on achieving outcomes. So in terms personal background, I've been working about 26 years. First 10 years were with GE in the US in technology. Moved back to India about 15 years ago, 16 years ago, and crossed over into the social sector. In terms of motivation, so I think the most rational or convincing motivation is just that blended finance approaches increase the quantum of capital. So we're not just increasing the quantum of capital in the development sector, but we are improving the effectiveness and efficiency with which this capital is deployed. So we're driving the much needed rigor in the sector, improving performance, much better leverage of philanthropic capital. So that's kind of the way the logical, rational answer. But from an organizational perspective, 361, has always believed in maximizing financial returns for our clients. So for the foundation to maximize social returns was, a natural evolution. Our brand purpose is performance plus. So increasing performance in the sector was also very, very synergistic. So like I said, our founding philosophy itself was, how do we have a far more catalytic approach to giving. Personally also, going back to what my background is, maybe it's the 10 years I spent with GE and maybe it's my hardcore Six Sigma training. But this concept of driving efficiency and effectiveness in capital, regardless of whether it's CSR or whether it's philanthropic capital, was something that I believed in. And the point I'm making is that unless you believe in this or are motivated by the concept and are inspired by the concept, it's difficult for you to champion change. There's a lot of stakeholder management that goes along with any program that's new, any innovation that's new. So I was trying to say, even at a personal level, you have to believe in this. And finally, I would actually have to thank all our implementation partners and intermediaries like Samrid, Revive, Satwa, Kois, the intermediaries who actually motivated us, inspired us, and joined us to reimagine grant giving, to think outside the box, to come up with some of these products and solutions and approaches. I think, Archish, you were responsible for one of those products or initiatives. So I would say, equal amount of thanks to all of them to provide the motivation for us to be able to do this. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Yes. Excellent. My name is Prabhir Correa. I lead the Philanthropy and Impact vertical at Waterfield. Waterfield is not very different from 361, a bit smaller. We also look at ourselves as a multi-family office, which means that we work largely with ultra HNI families. We work with around 200 families and are essentially their back-end family office. Now, what I mean by that is whenever there's money involved, we take care of everything that goes around that money. And on almost organic evolution of that was philanthropy, right? Because if we're helping you make your money, we should also help you give it away in a slightly more efficient way. A quick introduction to myself and my background. I'm actually an environmentalist. I used to work, study, and live in New Zealand in biodiversity, then eventually got into climate science. I wanted to do my PhD, but came back to India. Got into the NGO space, worked there for a couple of years, got severely underpaid, but learned more than I could ever. Then eventually moved on to the funder side, worked for Great Eastern CSR Foundation, which was the philanthropic arm of Great Eastern Shipping, and did everything from healthcare to livelihoods to education. Essentially became the personification of a jack of all trades and master of none over there. And then, of course, joined Waterfield to set up this vertical. But even prior to my joining of Waterfield, and to answer Archish's question, we were sort of looking at blended finance, I think, even before it sort of came into the lexicon of development finance. For the simple reason is that we were working with an organization called Northern Arc, and our families through Northern Arc were underwriting loans that were given out to MSMEs. Now, this was largely a first, not only for some of our families, but also for our wealth advisors, guys who look at money day in and day out, and who have historically always looked at rural India, or at least sectors like this, as financially untouchable, because they felt that these are areas where lending should not happen. Contrary to their beliefs, and thankfully, I think within the 7 years of that entire period, again, this is information that's come to me from my peers, not a single default happened. And I was just speaking to my MD just yesterday, and he was telling me that one of the key learnings that he had during this time was that one of the reasons small entrepreneurs do not want to, are definitely going to pay back, is because they don't have access to multiple sources of capital. And they are going to do everything to make sure that that one source of access is kept alive. They don't want to burn any bridges, which is why NPAs were almost non-existent during that time. Sort of an evolution of that, one of our clients who has also traveled the world, he came back and he said, look, there's this amazing thing called DIB that's happening abroad. Why don't you guys look at doing that? We did a research, and again, before my time, we did a lot of research. We, in fact, worked on creating something, in my opinion, which was very well thought out, very well created. It was the Lakpati Kisan Bond, because we'd done this with Tata. The only issue at that point of time was the timing, right? We came in at a time when families, who are essentially the core components of everything that we do, didn't understand blended finance at all. If they were wearing their investor hat, they didn't see this as a viable financial product. If they were wearing their philanthropy hat, they saw this as too complicated a form of philanthropy. So when I came in, we decided to do something a little differently. We decided, let's look at it from a not a cookie cut approach. Let's look at each family as a single unit. Let's figure out what works for them. Where does blended finance come in? And we learned very early on that education had to be the first thing that we were going to do with a lot of these families. We've done a little bit, obviously not as much as the others on the panel, but what I can tell you, and I'm sure we'll go to that, is the mistakes we made and what didn't work, right? And what we have learned from that. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alifya. I head impact for an impact investment firm called Grey Matters Capital. Grey Matters Capital has traditionally been an impact investor. It's family proprietary capital. And over the last 2 decades, GMC has made investments, equity investments in sectors such as microfinance, then eventually built the sector on education finance, where they enable lending to education-focused organizations, and then we expanded to EdTech as a sector, where we've made investment in the entire ecosystem of education and employment, the pathway from learning to earning. What we've seen over the last couple of years, especially post-COVID, with the post-COVID challenges, is that a lot of entrepreneurs, and we focus mainly on for-profit social entrepreneurs, so my perspective is going to be a bit different, is that a lot of entrepreneurs who have raised equity capital may or may not be able to provide the exits that they've promised to their investors. And the sectors that they work on, the idea of social enterprise is that to look at social impact as their first priority beyond profit. These sectors do not necessarily provide returns exponentially and quickly like equity investors would want, as much as equity investors would want. And what happens as a result of that is there are two things that can happen. One is that the entrepreneur is either forced to pivot their model and move to a new segment, which is more profit making and revenue generating, which kind of is a missed opportunity for the social impact that they could have created. Or the other unfortunate event could be that they are forced to close down their businesses because they just don't have access to more capital. That's when we realized the motivation for GMC was the entrepreneurs, the impact that the entrepreneurs were making. We could see the social difference that they were creating in the communities. But at the same time, they did not have access to affordable capital. And the motivation for GMC was to enable access to affordable capital so that they can continue doing the work that they do without having to further dilute their ownership or without having to pivot their model to a more profit-making community, target to a more profit-making community. So we started our work. Most of our investments have been impact-linked equity or impact-linked debt. We continue doing that impact. So what that means is when they achieve the impact that they've promised, the rate of return that they pay on the capital reduces, and it keeps reducing based on the impact that they achieve. So it incentivizes the organization to continue to achieving impact, as well as because this is proprietary capital, it also protects the loan, the capital that we've given, but we do take a hit on the returns that the entrepreneurs can pay back. So it's kind of a win-win situation for everyone involved, and there is further impact. The capital is then redeployed to create more impact. What we've also realized is that beyond impact-linked loans, there's also another gap that is becoming more and more pronounced now with all the research coming, is the lack of access to credit that women entrepreneurs face. Both women entrepreneurs themselves do not have as much capital as their male peers have. At the same time, organizations that are focused on benefiting women in terms of either employment, agriculture, so on and so forth across sectors, somehow are not perceived to be as revenue and profit generating as the organizations, as much as the organizations that don't have a gender focus. And we realize that we do need to enable gender equity more and more through capital. Of course, capital has its own power. And intentionally, what we've started doing is started blending different forms of capital through partnerships with accelerators, through partnerships with different forms of philanthropies, to say that they will provide the additional cost that it takes to provide technical assistance, or they will use the grant money, like the example that you gave. They will allow the recipient to use the grant money as credit guarantee so that it unlocks further forms of capital for the organization. Those are the pilots that we've been working on. I can speak more to the pilots when we come to the following sets of questions. With respect to my background, I've largely been in the impact sector for the last 15 years, moved around different seats around the table, right from being on the implementing side on the field to moving to impact consulting, philanthropic, managing a portfolio for a philanthropic organization for India, and then now head impact at Grey Matters Capital. What that does, it allows me perspective from different sides of the table, different lens. And I've done a master's in gender from Oxford University, which allows me to blend my academic hat with the impact investment hat. So it's a very interesting space for us to see how we can look at, we can use a gender lens not only for investing, but also for looking at enabling, sharpening programs so that they can reach a higher number of women, and who in turn can have a higher impact in their communities. So almost looking at capital as a tool for change, as opposed to along with profit and along with everything else, rather than just looking at profit making. So I'll pause at that and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you everyone for sharing your motivation behind entering into blended finance. So while the motivation may be a bit different, for example, for 361, it was actually to use the capital better, more efficient, and maybe more leverage on the capital that they are putting in the social sector. For impact investors, I see that while diversification is something that you have been looking at, And Prabhi, it's primarily what I see that the new age family offices or the philanthropists are looking for diversification as well when it comes to, say, creating impact on ground. The common thread which I think is coming here is at the end of the day, the motivation and goal is to provide access to capital, both for the non-profits and social enterprises, right? So I think that's the common thread that I see in the discussion that we had. Now, let's dig deeper into the experiences of each one of you. We have seen a lot of instruments being tried out. So some people are calling blended finance as a toolbox as well. We have seen structures like risk guarantees, returnable grants, impact bonds, which is being synonymously used with blended finance now, or technical assistance grants, which actually brings in a lot of other capital once it helps in creating those mechanisms. So, but the most of the one structure that is being most talked about in the media is impact bond. But an interesting fact to share: impact bonds have been the most media focused or have been most talked about, but as far as value is concerned in India, it represents only 2% of the overall Indian blended finance market. So there is also a need to look at the other ways to do blended finance mechanisms and especially talk about those mechanisms. So I'll ask you, Saumya, about your experiences. Given that 361 Foundation prioritizes financial inclusion and access to capital as a main lever for livelihood, what are some of the CSR compliant structures that you have been part of, and what have been the learning so far from them?
So it seems like blending is trending. I actually heard that at another conference 2 weeks ago. It's not my line, but I'll get to the structure. I hate to use the word structures and instruments. I'll get to the approaches in a minute. I just want to touch upon maybe 4 points to set the context. First, blended finance is not a one-size-fits-all, right? So in specific cases, it's a very, very unique, novel, catalytic way to scale, right? But it's not a one-size-fits-all, and you always start off with what is the problem you're trying to solve for and what kind of capital is needed. That's the first. Second, I would say, is that the readiness of the implementation partner, the credibility, the capability, the absorptive capacity of the implementing partner has a huge role to play. We don't undermine that. Third, and I don't know whether I should bring this up or not, but I will because you've nudged me to, from a compliance perspective, it's not a whole lot changes compared to traditional grant giving or check writing. Very simply put, these are all, at the end of the day, they're long-term project with measured impact, right? They are all aligned with Schedule 7. They're all benefiting the most marginalized or vulnerable people, right? So there's, take it a step further, even the CS certified fund utilization happens by March 31st. You're working with CSR compliant nonprofits. So I think what changes from a compliance perspective is how the implementing partner or the donee utilizes funds. At the end of the day, the donor is still giving a grant or a donation to a donee and getting an ATG. How the implementing agency is using it is what changes. So just wanted to demystify that from a compliance perspective, it's not that complicated. And the last, I know Archish mentioned that we thematically prioritize financial access and inclusion as a lever for livelihoods. But what we also believe in is holistic solutions. We're not just trying to provide access, financial inclusion and access to capital. We believe in overlaying that with skilling, training, capacity building, market linkages, unlocking government schemes, right? So it's a very holistic approach to livelihood improvement. And interestingly, most of our programs apparently I don't know, I don't think it was by design, but have a gender lens. So I think we have a majority, I don't have an exact percentage, but majority of our programs are actually helping women nano enterprises or women-led or even individuals or pharma producer companies. So now in terms of instruments or approaches, we've had 5 or 6, right? I'm not going to get into the details of too many, but let me just, the first concept, pay for outcomes, results-based aid, outcome-based financing, most of you all, I'm sure are familiar with that, right? But the donor pays once predetermined or pre-agreed outcomes are achieved. That is an underlying tenet in all our programs. We've done 2 pay for outcome type programs. The next approach, returnable grant, revolving grant, right? You all have heard of them. It's typically for the most vulnerable who are locked out of formal economy, say tribal populations, migrant populations, right? Very simply put, think of it as a zero interest loan with a moral obligation to repay. So you're giving a grant to the beneficiary and saying, if you can, once you've finished setting up your enterprise or once you've got your job, if you can give the money back to the non-profit to train the next or to rotate the funds further. So it's like pay it forward, right? Returnable grant. We've done 5 of these with different beneficiary cohorts and different not-profits with different beneficiary cohorts. So our first, I think, was with rural women artisans. Then we did tribal women nano entrepreneurs. Then we did migrant nano and micro entrepreneurs in rural Rajasthan, banking correspondents, and also farmer producer companies, Orissa and Maharashtra, yes, farmer producer companies comprising of women farmers. So returnable grants, also called revolving grants, was a second approach that we have kind of catalyzed. Third is risk guarantees. We've done 4 of these. Very simply put, risk guarantees, have you all heard of grants being used as risk guarantees? Yes, no? Very, very simply put, see, grants provide a very unique form of capital that's missing in the sector, right? Grants are patient, risk tolerant, they expect no return. So they can absorb risk. When you give a donation, you don't expect your money back, right? So it's a very unique form of capital that's very, very risk tolerant, very patient, and can be used to provide concessionality, to absorb the risk. So when you're giving a donation, if the donee use that donation as a guarantee to absorb the risk and bring a lender to the table to lend to the marginalized communities who they normally would not have lent to because of the perceived high risk or the inability to have collateral. So guarantee simply means, why can't the grant be used to unlock private capital, a commercial lender who expects a return? It could be an NBFC, right? We've done 4 of these, like I said. In fact, I won't get into details of most of them. I mean, we've funded enterprises that are eventually giving B2C kind of loans. We've also done it with, like, in a B2B kind of environment. I think Archish and Samrid was instrumental in structuring one of those. The 4th, one of our programs actually have a social success note also linked to that. That could be the 4th approach. Again, it sounds like jargon, but basically a social success note is kind of like what Alifya was saying. It's like impact linked debt. It's basically saying it's an outcome focused instrument, but it says if pre-agreed outcomes are achieved by the borrower, the cost of capital will further be reduced, right? So say the loan is given to a skilling entity to skill and place candidates. That's the outcome, placement. Skilling would be the output, placement is the outcome. What, and say they were borrowing at 10%, 12%, let's go with. What if we told the same entity that if you not just skill and place, but you prove retention, show me salary slips that those, say, school dropouts in Jharkhand who you all have placed are in their jobs for X months, we will reduce the cost of borrowing through another grant by Y amount, right? So it sounds, I mean, social success note sounds quite complicated, but it's essentially just think of it as impact linked debt, think of it interest subvention. Basically, interest burden is being incentivized by the donee against another based on outcomes. And the last approach that we are used is impact bond. I don't know whether I should get into the details of that or not, but let me. An impact bond is the risk capital is provided upfront by an investor who's expecting a return. That's the commercial capital. The NGO is given targets, outcome targets. The blending happens because a donor, also known as an outcome funder, promises to give the donation to the non-profit, to give back to the risk investor based on outcome achievement. So it's the donor basically waits on the sidelines until the outcomes are achieved and proven, often vetted by an independent third party. But the working capital required is provided by a risk investor. And I think many outcome-focused initiatives invariably have this inbuilt aspect. It may not be structured as a bond because money is needed upfront. The risk is taken by someone, right? If the donor is not paying until outcomes are achieved upfront, someone has to bear the cost. So this would be, this is a structured approach. It's called an impact bond. It's not these fixed coupon instruments that we often hear about. Bond. This is actually think of it as a tripartite agreement, and these become often long term. They were longer term tenure. So we're just about to embark on participating in one impact bond. So like I said, just to summarize, outcome-based financing is an underlying tenet to all our programs. But we have used vulnerable grants, risk guarantees, social success notes or impact-linked debt or interest subvention, I'll club them all together, and impact bonds as various CSR compliant approaches in our foundation.
So thank you so much, Saumya. Okay, how many of you think that we should have a dedicated masterclass on these instruments from Saumya?
There was one yesterday.
There was one yesterday, but it was basically more focusing towards the result-based financing. So, but
Really?
yeah.
I wasn't there.
But anyways, so I have been speaking to Saumya that you should come out and actually train people, right? So get in more CSR funders aligned with your philosophy, right? These are like, this is like music to my ears at least. I'm not sure about others. But anyway, so a lot of, I'll have a lot of questions for you, but due to paucity of time, I think I'll quickly move to the other one. While we have heard from Saumya that blended finance, when it comes to say blended finance, it cannot be applied like universal, right? You have to understand it, you have to tailor it accordingly by keeping in mind the implementer or the commercial partner you are bringing in, right? So I think that kind of approach is something which has worked well for 361 Foundation. I think it is still far that we can templatize some of these, but I think I'll come to that question a little later on the adoption, etc. But let me move to you, Prabhir. You spoke about the challenges initially, right? So would like to ask you, you have been working with a lot of families, right, in designing some of these instruments. So what are some of the challenges that you face, like both from the demand and supply side, since you work with both?
So I think challenges, I could write a book on challenges. And I think the first one is, I think Saumya, brought it out here, just a lack of familiarity, right? For the number of hands that you guys put up, had I been sitting with all my families in this room, all of them would have put their hands up, which makes me start off with pretty much at base zero, where a lot of families don't even understand what this is about. And when you think about these things, especially when they're financial terms that are thrown in, a lack of familiarity automatically brings resistance to even looking at some of these models. Coming back to my first point, when I just started speaking, I said, um, both from an investment and a philanthropic mindset, families were concerned because they didn't understand. They still don't, right? A lot of my work, even back when I had hair till now, has been on working with families, literally one on one, to try and explain to them the nitty gritties of what this is, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And in fact, we were speaking earlier, and Saumya was talking about measuring impact and then taking these stories out there. At least Ashish said taking these stories out there. That would be a massive help because we don't have enough success stories, uh, especially success stories which are as clearly explained, right? And we need these to basically even set the context before we start exploring some of these things. The next challenge, so that's challenge one. Challenge two is, I think, expectation building. Um, so within families, I mean, within all our families, right? I mean, you have parents, you have some, most of you must have kids. What you expect versus what your parents or your children expect in terms of how money should be used, how it should be earned, is very different. We've had families where the parents have been historically been giving to their temples for the last 20 years, while the child is passionate about coral reef restoration in the Andamans because he's a deep sea diver. Now, how do you connect the two, right? And what blended finance model would fit with these two? So, and then on the other side, you have individuals who come in with expectations, and Archish has been part of this conversation in the past, which don't even fit the bill. Where they say, "Look, I want to create something really nice. I want to, pump in a lot of money, but I want that money to be CSR money." And then CSR regulations don't allow for profit making. So unless the rules change, we can't really fit blended finance models to meet these particular individuals' requirements. Um, so I spoke about familiarity and then obviously expectations. And I think another one that often sort of goes unsaid is uh, there's an
Ravi, I hate to interrupt,
yeah,
but just
please.
right there, in terms of making returns from a from an outcome fund or the donor perspective, not once is the donor ever getting financial gain.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There could be an aspect of a commercial lender
No,
in
understood
a blended
exactly.
finance
Yeah,
solution, but
which is where the problem came in,
yeah,
where this
there's
particular individual expected donation to eventually lead to financial gain, and that
oh, okay.
expectation then needs to be clearly outlined that that's not how it works in this
Yeah,
particular stage.
there's always
right?
an investor and there's always a
Yeah,
donor.
yeah,
For
yeah.
a donor, it is
There
still
was
old school philanthropy,
which
no,
is
no
yeah.
interest, no return.
Now it takes this kind of conversation to
Yeah.
build, right? And it takes this kind of time and effort. And I think another thing is we often don't talk about resistance from maybe the NGO space on this as well. And I think it comes back to the whole lack of familiarity, right? But even and I don't blame the sector for the longest time. I was part of it for the longest time. Regulations have been so tight, especially with tightening of FCRA, tightening of, I think, if you have to have 35 AC back in the day, now we have removed that. Now ATG is under the scanner, I've heard. And suddenly, when you have all these things being tightened, and then on the other hand, you have people talking about financial instruments and all of these different complex systems out there. I don't blame the sector from being, a little skeptical and saying, look, I'm taking in money. I'm happy to use it the way I've been doing it for the last 100 years, and this is the way I see myself going. But what happens is you have a lot of good work that's going out there, which can be scaled through blended finance, but there's resistance on this side. Um, and I think another challenge, which is again, and this is more of an internal challenge, right? And something that I've had to face internally. We work with wealth advisors. I mean, the people front facing the clients are our relationship managers. They are individuals who, I'm not a numbers guy, I'm a trees and animals guy. They are the guys who understand numbers. They don't understand impact, right? So they can't make the connect between the two. For them, these kind of models are just too complicated. They're like, I rather put, conventional mutual funds or look at an AIF or something like that. They understand impact investing from the AIF category side. They're still skeptical about the impact piece. But the moment you talk to them about blended finance, then there's a problem. And I feel this is an issue, and maybe you might, you work with wealth advisors as well, across the ecosystem, both on to your point about both sides of the game. You have individuals who don't understand it well enough, so have that restriction of going out and talking to individuals about it. And if you need the evangelist first and foremost need to understand this internally. I'll be very honest, I mean, I don't know it in its entirety, right? I mean, I'm hoping to learn from these two the more I speak. Um, but I have people who are going out and working with clients day in and day out who have perfect opportunities to go and start speaking to them about these things. And they don't do that because they have the resistance. And why that the reason that this is important is because let me just give you some context. There's about 200 families. We manage around $4.3 billion of assets. So you kind of do the math, right? They're individuals with very deep pockets. And not only do they have deep pockets, they have deep influence, right? They are some of the promoters of some of the largest companies in the country. So not only do they have their own personal wealth, they also have their own CSR, which they manage really well. Now, if inputs come directly from them, you will see a lot more change. Change is top down, right? It's not always bottom up. Bottom up is even much harder. So you need to kind of have that change, and we are seeing, right? I'm not saying that the change hasn't happened. In fact, we have somebody over here who's looking at one of our families who's been looking at impact and blended finance for a while. We've recently been speaking to a very interesting family in Gujarat who wants to set up a water fund. And the whole reason they want to do that is because they've been doing excellent work in water for the last 10 years, like mind-blowing work in water. And they're saying, the simple question to us, is there a way we can do this better? And what was music to my ears at that point of time was the CSR head came and said, I want to learn about blended finance so we can then structure a program that will work in our favor. But very rarely will you see people coming ahead and saying, look, I want to learn more about this space. So yeah, I think it's a challenge across the board, but I think we have individuals making a difference.
Thank you, Prabhi. A lot of great insights, I would say, to look at this particular lens as well, right? Where we don't get to hear a lot about what investors are expecting when it comes to, say, social impact. So while I was going to ask this question a bit later, so I can come to that later, but let me turn to you, Alifya. You have been an evangelist when it comes to, say, gender inclusive programs, right? So you have been doing it throughout your life. How are you using that experience that you had, right, into some of these blended finance structures by bringing this gender lens into your work?
So it's everything that was said plus the layer of gender. Essentially, what is the problem that we are trying to address? It's at multiple fronts. One is that there isn't enough capital in the hands of women. Second is, even when there's capital in the hands of women, it does not necessarily percolate down into the organization to mean leadership at the board, leadership at the senior management, gender-friendly organization policies, and of course, most importantly, gender transformative, gender sensitive, gender progressive products and services. A lot of times, the lens of gender needs to be very intentional because somehow a lot of people in power just assume that products have equal benefits to all genders. Products and services have equal benefits to all genders. But now we have more and more evidence to prove that every product, including capital, will not benefit everyone in the room equally. There are people who have different starting points. There are people who come with more privileges. And as a matter of fact, unfortunately, gender also gives privilege to one over the other because of societal factors. What we are doing is reflecting on how do we ensure that, one is how do we ensure that we don't further the problem. Second is how do we ensure that with our capital, we are able to bridge some of these gaps. Of course, one organization or one entity will never be able to solve for a societal problem that has been for many generations. But if in our individual capacities, if we can be sensitive about who we are deploying to, what is the impact goal, what are the processes and approaches that we are following, we probably will be able to solve for some of the gaps. Again, because this is such a huge, the gaps are so huge at multiple levels, what we are doing is we are championing partnerships. Essentially, if you look at blended finance, what is it about? It's essentially different kinds of capital, different kinds of organizations with different kinds of capital coming together. So in my head, simplification of blended finance would be just bring in partnerships where different kinds of organizations doing different kinds of work can work towards a common goal. So that's the way we are looking at blended finance. When we look at defining goals, when we look at defining outcomes, along with everything that's said, gender, the impact on women is one of the important levers that we measure. And then we say that the rate of interest would be directly linked to the impact that they would have on women, both within the organization and the leadership level. So there are goals that the recipient organization commits to in terms of leadership, employment, parity, and in terms of the impact that the product or service would have. And depending on where they are on the impact spectrum, the rate of interest is then determined, or rate of interest changes based on the impact that they achieve. Besides that, what we've started venturing into is partnerships with different kinds of organizations who are very gender focused. So there are lots of organizations and accelerators that provide technical assistance to promote gender lens. What we are doing is we've started partnering with them more and more intentionally to say that can you support, because gender lens does not come naturally to all kinds of social entrepreneurs. What we started doing is can you intentionally support integration of gender lens across, right from the design stage itself to the implementation and then to the measurement. 3 pilots that we've done along these lines is, one is we've provided capital to a fintech partner who is then going to use the capital as a credit guarantee to further unlock capital for women, small and medium-sized women entrepreneurs. So what that does is our capital is being leveraged 5x times, which is then going to be further leveraged multiple times because it's going to be a revolving fund for women entrepreneurs who take the loan, use the loan, and repay it back. They have cycles of 3 months for repayment. So every time the capital comes back, it's repaid, then it's further redeployed into the hands of other women, or the same women can take further loans. What this does is that it is what we are trying to do is reach women who are otherwise unbanked or who are new to credit, so that they can build a credit history for themselves and eventually access further commercial loans, which are at a reasonable, affordable rates of interest. So that's one pilot in the financial inclusion space. The other pilot that we've done is with a skilling organization. So we've provided them capital to design income sharing agreements for their skilling, for women participants to enter the manufacturing sector. So a lot of jobs in the manufacturing sector are decently paid, well paid compared to the informal work that that these communities would otherwise have to do. What they're using the capital for is to work with corporates who have manufacturing hubs, provide skilling, and then eventually there's a contract between the program participant. It's a tripartite contract between the skilling organization, the program participant, and the corporate who's hiring the program participant to eventually pay back the training fees over a period of 6 months. So what that does is it almost becomes like a revolving pool of capital that the organization can further redeploy for a new batch of women. So essentially this is addressing the problem at 2 levels. One is it is addressing the direct problem of lack of capital, but the other and bigger challenge that it is addressing is addressing the gender norms. It's challenging the gender stereotype of women in non-traditional livelihood sector, especially in manufacturing sector, which is predominantly male dominated as of now, and unlocking different kinds of jobs that are otherwise traditionally not accessible to women from underserved communities. And that impact is what is going to determine the rate of capital for these kind of organizations. What we've seen is that it has created a bottoms-up demand because more and more skilling organizations want to access this kind of capital. And the last one that we've deployed is for business line innovation with a entity who is going to develop a new skilling vertical, especially targeting women who want to work from home and have access to jobs and placement facilities in their neighborhood itself, rather than migrating to different cities. This is more like a returnable grant / zero coupon loan, where they will use the money to build this business line vertical over the next 3 years. The idea is to find an outcome funder who can pay based on the outcomes achieved, so that then pool of money can be redeployed for a new group of program participants. Again, the idea is to provide the risk capital involved, because all of these pilots that I mentioned have a certain risk. We are willing to take the risk, but what we are also doing is bringing on board different partners who can kind of take some of the credit guarantees, provide some credit risk guarantee, so that because for us, capital is important and it needs to be protected. We don't have access to grant money that can be deployed and forgotten about. We do need the capital to be returned back. And what we have realized is, I know one of the questions was, what are the enablers of success? And probably we will not have time for that, so I'll just say it here itself. One of the important enabler for success of blended finance is going to be how willing are different kinds of organization to flexibly design pilot, even if it means failure for the first couple of transactions. Because unless we learn and figure out what works for whom and for what kind of constituency, we probably will never have one solution that fits all. So flexible designing, learning together is something that we will have to do for the next couple of years, and simplifying the language that we use and simplifying the structures that we use will make it more accessible to more kinds of organization. I'll pause at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alifya. Those was great insights, and I believe that if we have gender lens included in the blended finance mechanism itself, it is going to have a long-lasting impact. I've been told that we are short of time, so while I had a lot of questions to ask the panelists, but I'll request panelists to have the concluding remarks, including Prabhir, if you can also mention about whether you see blended finance becoming an asset class for the new age investors or not. But would start with you, Prabhir, and then Saumya, and then maybe Alifya as the last concluding remarks.
I think a controversial answer to your controversial question. As an asset class, no. Simple. Not at least till it's evolved a little more. Simple, think about it this way. Would you suddenly start looking at an investment that's new to the market, very jazzy, very complicated, you would be a little skeptical, right? And understand where the skepticism is coming from families. The moment it's looked at as an asset class, as an investment vehicle, take baby steps. Let's look at it from a philanthropic angle. In fact, I would rather position this, and I do position this, as a way of saying this is a slightly more advanced way of doing philanthropy. Once we reach a stage where Alifya's work, where Saumya's work gets out there, success stories are shared a little more, then we can possibly start looking at a few families who have that risk appetite to say, okay, maybe let's look at this as part of your investment pool.
I think doing good in a better way. You just sort of more evolved from doing philanthropy. So, concluding remark, next year, the same summit, I'd love to see 4 of you all in our seats sharing your success stories. But no, I think conversations such as these, and I think as complexities in the sector continue to evolve, it is critical to be innovating, right? As the funding gaps improve, as complexities improve, it is critical for all of us to be innovating and thinking outside the box, reimagining how we could do stuff in a better way. On the demand side, there's certainly, I hope, there's a lot of need for capacity building and helping implementing agencies understand the more than financial, the implementation aspects of blended finance. So I hope to see that change. On the supply side of the capital, CSR has traditionally been very grant-based, but there is certainly a huge opportunity for CSR to be far more catalytic in its approaches. Also, HNI capital and domestic foundation capital, I think it would be great to see people think outside the box more and evolve from the traditional check writing charity mindset. And while blended finance is in its infancies, I'm very confident that conversations like these, people like my co-panelists here, and game changers in the audience will continue to pave the way to both on the demand side and the supply side to increase participation and structuring of some of these approaches. So, thank you.
I mean, +1 to everything that was said. I think just in one line, simplify simplify at multiple levels, including within our organizations to begin with. And the other thing is to customize. I think a lot of these transactions will need customization based on who we are working with, who is providing the wealth and capital, and who's also taking the capital. And customization is also going to be a key, because that's going to enable more and more participants in these kind of structures.
Do we have time for audience questions? We can take two? Okay, 2 questions. Okay, we'll start with you.
So, yeah. Can there be a real life example in the health sector of a blended finance mechanism?
Anyone would like to take that? So I had the chance to work in such kind of facility. It's Samrid Healthcare Blended Finance Facility. It is sponsored by USAID, and it's now around, I think, $250 to $300 million facility, which has combined both the philanthropic capital and commercial capital together, and have created some of the instruments which Saumya mentioned. Yeah, and one of those was funded by 361 Foundation as well. So, and both for-profits and non-profits can approach that particular facility, and you can see what can work for you. Right. Any other question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
So, looking at the curve of my hair, I can say in this stage of my life that I have had enough experience on both sides of this conversation. When Prabhir was talking about, wealth managers not appreciating. So it reminded me of my previous avatar in banking, where I spent time managing the still true when I talk to my colleagues. I've been in the social sector for about 7 8 years. It is still true that Thanks. Yeah, so there's a huge gap to fill. There's still much appreciation at that end to people to understand and realize that there is this great avenue. Because in my mind, finally, wealth generation is all about the kind of impact that money can make. And I think that's what goes for impact, blended finance and impact investments. What probably needs to happen, and I agree with all of you here, is that there is certainly a great need for exposure to these opportunities on both the demand side or supply side, and certainly an uptick or betterment in the capability on the demand side to absorb. Because when you put finance along with philanthropy, the expectation of the financier, if I can use the term money bags, is that, my money should be put to use in the same efficient manner by, let's say, the social sector as it would be in the financial space, because and investors are used to that kind of efficiency. So maybe that's one area to look at. If you can bring that change about, India is at a cusp in its economic development and social challenges that there's enough avenue for it.
Is there a question or a comment?
That was just an observation. I'm very sorry.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'm really sorry to mention that we have an next.
Okay, just one concluding remark. Thank you everyone for the amazing insights. It's clear that blended finance may not be a silver bullet, but it's surely a transformative force, and we are going to see a lot of such kind of facilities or structures coming up. I would just like to say one last line, which I think is relevant for everyone in the room here, right? Because you must be the decision maker in one way or the other. So the line is, no matter how big or small, every decision that we take has the power to shape the communities, shape the lives, and our shared destiny. So with that note, I'll say thank you to our amazing panel here, and hope to see you again soon.